Great. We'll take some questions from the floor. We've got 20 minutes, but I'd just like to recycle Kirsty's quotation, which was "Wha's like us," but you didn't finish it. It's "Wha's like us, dem few that are deed," and that's something of what I was reminded of when you were talking, Arabella.
Oh. Why aren't we all dead? You
Exactly.
was thinking.
That's right. But let's. I just got one or two things that absolutely fascinated me after you'd all spoken, and it was really to do with speed, to do with the speed of change. I mean, Chris, when you talked about, mobile phones disappearing in 10 years, something that you wore, became the way in which you got information like you do on your phone and so forth, and talking about drones emptying the streets and car parks and so forth. It was the speed, Moore's Law, I think you quoted, 1960, seems to be getting faster and faster. And Kirsty, when you spoke about the time for movement, for things spontaneously, as it were, to appear, literally people on the streets, again, that seemed to me to be about acceleration, about things happening in ways that we couldn't have anticipated, and doing so very quickly. And then, Philip, when you produced these charts and so on, which were completely counterintuitive to me, I just didn't expect that at all. And I thought, how on earth do we begin to make sense of all of this? Who's going to tell us what the hell is going on? And
the techie guys.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's, and talking about the nature of Scotland and Scots and their attitudes and so on, words like thrawn, I hear, and so on. I wonder how we're going to do this. How are we going to reorganize, recalibrate a sense not only of where we're going, but what's happening right now? I think it's fascinating and, to me, confusing, but maybe I'm extremely stupid, and maybe everybody else has got it. I mean, how do you guys see it? Go ahead.
Take a bit of that. I think it's quite interesting. I mean, there's sort of old-fashioned constructs around nationalism and things that are around today. I mean, I'm not saying that people shouldn't feel, pride in their place, whether it be, their local, very local, as in their town or their city or the country they live in. But I think the generations that are coming through now have far more affinity with interest groups. Talk about movements. Okay. They'll form a movement, and a movement won't be formed by who's round the corner. A movement will be formed by, it may be quite niche, but to get to a niche that's then 2 million wide across the world is a couple of clicks away. So I still think, and this goes to some of the issues that were talked about by Philip around governance, and constitutional issues, is actually, as we move forward, this idea that governance and place, defined by geography, is what should define us, I think will start to go out the window. And the generations coming through will just not care. We'll be completely. I mean, it's quite interesting when you talk about Brexit, when you talk economically about the challenges we may face with trade tariffs. The world I live in doesn't. Trade tariffs mean nothing. If we're going to send a piece of software somewhere, we click a button and it's there. There are no import taxes on the code behind video games or anything like that. So I think a lot of the challenges that you're seeing are like the death throes of the old way of doing things. And it's partly that's generational. The people that are in power in either senior in government, civil service, thinking about the kind of rules that we live by, haven't really embraced the way things happen now. Because you were saying, well, how are we going to know? Actually, we're all quite comfortable now, the generation that relies on technology, with, I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to know, but something will emerge, and we'll let people decide, and we'll come out, and then we'll all follow it. So
uncertainty's okay? I mean,
uncertainty's fine.
Yeah, okay. Okay, how do you respond to that, Kirsty?
I think the thing that makes me nervous is how much Scotland is talking to itself about itself, because how we cope with the accelerating pace of change is dependent on how ready we are to learn. And we all stop learning when we close down and we don't seek out input and information and challenge from elsewhere. And the world is talking about this with the prism of fake news and echo chambers. The whole world is talking about this danger of us turning in on ourselves and only speaking to people who agree with us. But I think that danger is, although worldwide, particularly acute in Scotland. And if you look historically to the people we most admire, the kind of Eric Liddles of the world who go and live in China, and the David Livingstons of the world who go and chart Africa. And we have a great history of people seeking information, bringing it home, enriching the debate through being very porous and open. And my anxiety is, well, the national question is extremely complex and deserves its hearing. I worry we are going to miss the pace of change and miss some of the creative input that we could get from speaking to others and seeking their input if we are turning in on ourselves. You know, when we're having audits of how many people in how many bits of public life in Scotland are English, when we're auditing that and seeing that as something terrible rather than something absolutely fantastic that people, intellectuals and creative people and people in broadcasting want to come to Scotland, I think that's something very dangerous, very countercultural from Scottish history actually, but also very anachronistic in the world we face now, which is one where we must have all eyes and ears open to the widest possible group of people for input.
But Philip, I mean, what Chris is saying in a way goes counter to Kirsty's observations. You know, I mean, the internet, the reach of digital technology is global. You can talk to people in China, Argentina. What was it about Argentina, by the way, that made it unusual? Oh, you took it off? Oh.
Yeah, I left it.
Oh, right.
Okay,
Well, shout.
Sorry, I just realised I'd taken my microphone off. I'm sorry. If you look at the 400 years of globalization, oh, thank you very much. If you look at the,
It's not on.
is it on?
It's on
now. If you look at the 400 years of globalization, it was a fairly simple pattern. It was kind of a linear relationship in terms of the growth of integration in different parts of the world. In almost every indicator, foreign investment, movements of people, movements of goods, everything. The problem is what happened in the 20th century. The 20th century was a very strange century because of the two world wars, the global depression in between them, and then the Bretton Woods system afterwards, where the architecture of international relationships was structured around the fixed currency parities, limited capital mobility, and so on. The 20th century was a century of anti-globalization. In fact, if you look at the levels of foreign investment relative to GDP, at the outbreak of the First World War, we're not reaching together until 1972. So older generations of people in the UK were brought up in a very different world to the younger generations. I'm 52, I'm just on that cusp. The world that my parents were brought up in was a completely different world. You know, my little 3-year-old is way better than on an iPad than I am. I simply don't understand how he gets to where he gets. Now, the difficulty is that people have different responses. How to manage that, how to cope with this change, which is so gigantic. People who are IT savvy, for them this is just normal, this is a way of life, they don't think about it. But for many people it's not. So there's an element of fear as well. And this was the Argentina case, it's so important. All you need is 10 years of introspection and a tendency to become more closed. Argentina is the only country in the world that went from one of the richest countries in the world. In the 1930s it was richer than France and Germany, and almost everywhere in Europe, to a developing country. All you need is 10 years of political pressure to become inwards, and that has such profound long-term implications. And this is what happened in the Argentina case. My issues about governance are really the question of how to connect individuals, community groups, civic society, entrepreneurs, universities, networks of SMEs, how to connect them in ways which are much better so governance things are not too distant. That they just think, well, I can't be involved in those things, it just has no effect on me. So it has to come down to a level that people feel is connecting with them, that they can do things, but it has to be done in a way that also connects with the rest of the world out there. And it's trying to find that balance is a very complicated issue.
I mean, I'm just back in a damp cottage on the shores of Loch Awe, you know, thinking about your parents, and indeed all of our parents, because all of us bring, you know, like on our back, you know, all these attitudes, and we hark back, at least I do, sometimes nostalgically, okay, with occasional tinge, but, you know, they were brought up in the time when, you know, little towns had town councils with provosts.
Well, one of the things that actually a friend of mine who's 80 and from Scottish, and my dad would be 91 if he were alive, they both said that they would never have thought of leaving of Scotland. The 80-year-old said if it hadn't been for national service, and my dad was just old enough to do the last year of the Second World War. But he said other than that, it would never have occurred to them to leave Scotland. And they did both make their fortunes out of Scotland. I mean, my dad didn't make a fortune, but when he became successful. And the other guy, he said, I wouldn't have dreamt of doing any of the things I'd done if I'd stayed in Scotland. But I don't know, but that, you know, that's a generational thing. I mean, what I was thinking about when you were talking, and my kids are just 19 and 17, and they never need to read any instructions. So we bought, you know, a Digibox. I know that's quite old-fashioned now, but Xbox Digibox, if that's what it is, you know, the one that you get all the channels through. See, I don't even know what it is. iPhones, and they've each got, they're spoiled, iPads and all that thing. They never read the instructions, and they know everything to do on it. And I said, how do you know? And they just said, because it's obvious. And I said, but how do you know to draw? You know, and I can barely use I can use my Mac to write books on, but I can't do anything else on, and emails and stuff. And because there's nothing in their brain telling them, why is it that? It's all just, you know, they're not particularly bright either, so, you know.
Roadblocks, yeah.
No, they are. But they've got no barriers at all to any of the stuff that is making us anxious, and the what if I get it wrong, and, you know, they just go, well, if you get it wrong, you fix it, and nothing's ever a disaster on a computer unless you drop it into a bath of acid.
I mean, it's, you know, that I remember in the 1980s when I you know, kind of famously, Clive Sinclair, that great Cambridge-based entrepreneur and slight madman, you know, really gave the UK a massive leap up alongside the BBC in getting computers into all of our hands at a very, very low cost. As a slight aside, the reason Dundee has flourished in the computer games industry is Clive chose Timex factory in Dundee to be a subcontractor to make the Timex. So everywhere else in the world, or in the UK, it's about £149, you know, reasonably affordable. In Dundee, the going rate was about a £5 on a packet of Embassy Regal. So it's, I mean, you know, it's not something to build economic policy on, but certainly the black economy of ZX Spectrums has created the computer games industry in Dundee. You know, and on a more serious note, when those computers came in, I remember it vividly. There was this parental-child divide where children were just bashing the keys and said, don't do that, you'll break it. And then people would say, well, you can't break it by software alone. You could break it with a hammer, you can drop it in the bath, but you can't. And today, it's entirely the same. It's this kind of learning by doing thing. We all learned to program because we got magazines. There was no mass media. You couldn't download it. There was no internet to download from. There was no floppy disks. There was cassettes that you could load tapes on, code on, if anybody remembers back then. But fundamentally, what we did is we opened these magazines and typed in the programs, and we made mistakes. And by making the mistakes, you know, so it was somebody else's, you know, guess what? That's what you do with music. It's what you do with literature. You know, you read other people's, you copy it down, you try again. You know, drawing. It's the same process and technique for technology, and it's not that difficult. There's the big secret. None of it is that difficult. And then layer on top of that, and this is this whole point about, you know, never-ending lifelong learning. Right now, any of us, and professionally we all do this now, none of us bother going on courses. We don't kind of read, you know, the manuals to the latest programming languages. We start doing it, and then we Google. We Google constantly, and we borrow snippets from other people, and we put things together, and it's amorphous. So I'm seeing people deliver code that's a bit of a shambles. It doesn't really work very well, but actually they couldn't code 2 weeks ago, and it works. Yeah. So it doesn't matter. Yeah. You know, and I think those kinds of processes are going to apply to everything we do. It's not just writing technology. You know, the barriers to achieving anything now are purely imagination and confidence. So long as you've got imagination and confidence, the tools are out there to do anything you want. Yeah. Losing weight might be a slightly different challenge.
That's never going to be done by a computer, unfortunately. No, but can't outsource that.
But I think societally, those changes are coming through. You know, people coming through now, generations, and it's not an age thing, it's an attitude thing. People, and I say, well, actually, why can't I? Yeah. Why can't I move here? Why can't I do that? Who's going to stop me? Yeah. I've got a slight hypothesis that some of the populism, nationalism that we're seeing is almost a last death throw of people who are being disenfranchised by everything. You know, so they're the ones who I can't stand this amount of change and I don't know how to deal with it. And their last throw is to kind of hold on to some, you know, some view, you know, some rose-tinted view of what once was. But that's going to be transient. You know, by this 2025, they'll be consigned to history and we'll be marching onwards, I would certainly hope.
Well, there you go. That's fine. What do you make of that, Kirsty?
I think the sense that people have, it's why I use the phrase frightening and frightened. Yep. That actually the people who are most toxic and who are driving the extremism and who are driving the division are afraid, undoubtedly. We have to be very, very careful, though, about somehow explaining something and excusing something are morally quite different processes. So analytically, we can say these may be forces may be driven by disenfranchisement, but that doesn't mean you don't stand up and fight them, because actually the consequences of that disenfranchisement are across the world really, really frightening, and it does take people of good conscience who are willing to do the analytics as to what's driving it, but also stand up and take it head on. And my worry is, slightly what I was touching on before, is if there are no points of connection, if there are no moments where we must discuss, must debate, must concede that people, although their analysis might be different, their intentions aren't, when we don't have a common square to have the conversation, we're in a very, very dangerous terrain. And as I say, whenever I'm in Scotland, I see that increasing polarisation and lack of a common square as very, very frightening. And that's why environments like this one are so important for us to have conversation.
So, I mean, I would totally agree. The one thing with, you know, and let's just assume that disenfranchisement is real and partly down to technology, and then if you listened to some of the points I was putting over about, so say, driving, there's going to be an awful lot of disenfranchised people out there come 2025, and it's incumbent on us as a society to work out how to enfranchise these people again, you know, because you're dead right. I'm not suggesting, we just excuse them because they're disenfranchised, but what we need to do is not only slap them down for doing something that is abhorrent or whatever, but we then need to work out how to longitudinally bring them back in as part of this new society, because that's where it ends in absolute disaster. If I'm going to take my normal optimistic head off and look at the most bleak scenario, it's a division like we've never ever seen before. You know, it's you know, I mean, sort of Dickensian divisions of class and things will pale into insignificance versus those that have worked out how to be economically viable in the future, and those that have got the bleakest of the bleak. And you know, if one goes into some pretty challenged housing estates in Scotland, you can see what that begins to look like with third and fourth generation unemployed. You know, and absolutely no idea of how to hook back into the economic drivers.
Well, Philip, you talked about the geography of discontent. Is that what Chris is describing?
Yes, it is, and it's exactly what you're describing. Actually, one particular observation I've got that links a lot of these issues is the question of ageing. Our society is ageing year on year at an enormous rate because the structure of the demographic tree, the baby boomers are now retiring, and that was the largest growth in population. So what's happening is the proportion of people who are in a post-employment context is becoming bigger than ever, and the proportion of people who are in the employment cohort is falling relative to the non-employed, the post-employed group. And of course, also those groups are these two different groups that we're talking about. Now, of the older age groups, historically, if you think about national insurance, pensions, historically, the older age groups, the retired cohorts, were the poorest group in society. And of course, one of the big issues about national insurance and so on was to overcome that. But what's happened in the UK, probably more than just about any other country in the world, is because of the effect on housing wealth. Now what we've got is a big proportion of our older cohorts are super wealthy, wealthier than the next 2 or 3 generations are likely to be. At the same time, there is also an older group in that age cohort which are extremely poor and vulnerable because of these reasons. They have no way of getting back in. So one of the big issues is, how do we think about these intergenerational things? It's not just a matter of raising the pension age 2 years. It's much more complex than that, because it's also spatially delineated. You see all of these housing estates, You can name places, you can see them in your head. What you see is local young people tend to be the people who are not engaged in the way that you're talking. Large numbers of elderly people on very low incomes. You know, many people are actually coming back into the workforce in their 70s. It's work poverty. Where at the same time, we've got other parts of the country where young people are prosperous and viable, and so are the older groups. So there's a community issue here in terms of social cohesion. And I spoke about this publicly, and I wasn't being controversial. I just asked a question. When we had the city devolution deal in England for Manchester, which was the first big one, the centrepiece of the Manchester deal was integrating social care and healthcare, which there's at a city level. Now, there's many good arguments for that in terms of the public provision, access to doctors, links with hospitals and so on. There's many good arguments about that. But my first question is, has anyone looked at the demographics? Because over the next 20 years or 30 years, you have to know that the working age population is going to be growing in your locality relative to the non-working age population. And in a city like Manchester, that's happened in the last 15 years, largely because of in-migration from outside of the UK. London has a very beneficial labour market structure. It's the youngest city in Britain because lots of young, high-income people, highly educated people, the kind of people you're talking about, come from many different countries. It's not really a migration problem within the UK. It's people coming from other countries to work in London. So London is in a favourable position. But there are many cities in the UK, if you look at their demographics, you've got the young cohort are not in the group that you're talking about, and neither are the older cohort. Who's going to fund this? And this is what happened, I said the Detroit problem. This is what happened in Detroit. The pension system collapsed because the local employment wasn't big enough. So when I think about a constitutional convention, these are the things that have to be rethought. The whole national insurance scheme has to be rethought. How we think about education and skills tied in with health has to be rethought. The relationship between charitable, civic society, third sector actors, because often they're the most innovative kinds of actors who can bridge these gaps. Government can't do this kind of stuff. And so my idea of a constitutional, it's not my idea, many people have been thinking along these lines, is a fundamental rethink as much as anything else about social cohesion, because our world is doing that. It's completely doing that. I tell my students I did a PhD without ever sending an email. They laugh. I ask them when it was, they have no idea. I said there was no PDFs, there was no internet. They just laugh. They think it must be, you know, when dinosaurs were wandering around. It's incredibly recent. But the young generation have got no concept of what their grandparents' understanding of the world is. And this is a problem which is going to get much more complicated and much quicker. And it's the biggest crisis in the health service now, is how to manage the demographic shift.
Let me conclude by asking each of you the same question. Where do you think, or where would you like, in one particular regard, I mean, let's try and fine it down if you can, where would you like Scotland to be in 2025? What single thing would improve life, make us a more civilised country, a better place to live? I'll pick on you, Arabella.
Somebody, well, in fact, you mentioned it again today. I'd like more people to live in Scotland. I'd like lots more people from the south, whatever nationality they are, to find, you know, apart from Scotland's beautiful, leaving that aside, just it's the ridiculous imbalance of how much space there is in Scotland and how few people there. Somebody told me, I mean, obviously I'm Scottish, but there are 10 times as many Scots, first-generation Scots, living outside Scotland than there are in Scotland. And, I mean, obviously you can't repatriate people or make them, but if you know, and then, of course, as we know, and I saw a documentary, there's a couple of Syrians living in Butte, well, maybe more now. I mean, not necessarily about put refugees there, because that's not necessarily the answer, but I just think we need to sort of spread it out a bit. It's all a bit bottom heavy.
Okay, Kirsty.
I think I would start where Chris ended. So I think Scotland just have one of the most admired, most copied, most successful education systems anywhere on the face of the earth. And I don't just mean in higher education that Chris was talking about, but in primary and secondary education too. And falling educational standards in Scotland, I think, is a national shame and scandal. So I think there is something to be said for Chris's point about how do we skill Scottish children for the jobs of tomorrow? So how do we drive educational standards back up so that people are ready for high quality, stimulating, meaningful, dignified work? But there's a flip side of that people aren't just economic units. One of the amazing things about the Scottish education system used to be the absolute, unequivocal, egalitarian sense that the best of human culture was for everybody. And when I first moved to England, I found the idea that kind of so-called high culture was seen as a sort of snobby or middle class thing completely alien. Because I grew up in a city with the Citizens Theatre, and you could go to the theatre for £4 and it was seen as totally normal that you might come out of mine or a shipyard and read Tolstoy. And the idea that that's one of the things that Scotland's education in the kind of liberal arts and philosophically based sense that Scottish education and the Enlightenment gifted to the world has been lost. So a rejuvenation of Scotland's educational standards with modernity and readiness for work, combined with that really deep, ferocious, egalitarian focus on excellence. If we were to recapture that and give it to the world, I think that'd be a tremendous contribution.
Philip?
Well, obviously I'm not Scottish, but all the empirical work for my PhD was driving around week after week, getting data from the Scottish electronics industry back in the late 80s. So I know more of central Scotland than many Scots do. And Scotland is a marvellous country. The most important thing for me is to have an attitude which is open, that looks out all the time, does not become introspective. Once you become introspective, everything starts to turn in the wrong direction. Is to be looking outwards all the time and thinking about new opportunities, new possibilities, and not being afraid to try stuff. That's what innovation's about. And innovation is not just, let's say, high-tech entrepreneurs. That's what's one form of innovation. But we can think about innovation in government, in education, in civil society. Look for lessons in other countries.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for
Thanks
for leaving the last.
I gave you longest to think, though.
Indeed, you did. I've changed it 4 times, though. Clearly I'm going to echo some of the things that have been said around education. I mean, it's worth reflecting, that in the time of, Adam Smith and David Hume, the school system in Scotland, which at that point I think was unequivocally the best, was the church, was the church system. And it was, and those kids were, in some ways, horrifically schooled. It was sort of 5, 6 a.m., full day, 6 days a week, Sunday off to go to church. And that turned out, people like Hume and Smith, who by 15 and 16 were on their second, university degrees and things. So I'm not suggesting a recapture of exactly those values, but actually in a communication-led society, we should be able to supercharge our education system in some way that's never been done, never been done before. And that has to sit at the core of what I believe Scotland needs to be, which is the most entrepreneurial society in the world. We'll never be the biggest. We'll never have the highest GDP. That's there are natural resources that will lean on that. But we can be the most entrepreneurial. We can recapture that Enlightenment spirit, and to the open border point, make us the crossroads for the greatest in ideas, creativity, and business in the world, so that the world almost sees Scotland as a super hub for those. But that will only start if our education, both school and tertiary, both primary, secondary and tertiary, are the best and are reinvented. But it's going to take some really radical entrepreneurial thinking to make that happen, because dogma around is, every parent still wants their kid to have access to the right university and be at a school that's on the right league table. That has to disappear as a way of thinking, and we need to prepare people for 2025.
Now, before I ask you to thank our superb panel, let me say that Gordon Brown is very happy to sign copies of his excellent book on Europe in return for a £5 donation to the Gordon Aikman charity. And we'll do that after this session. But meanwhile, please thank Philip McCann, Kirsty McNeil, Arabella Weir, and Chris van der Kuil. Well done, guys.